Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Welcome back to Explore, Explain. Not a new episode. It is part 2 of an existing episode pairing. In the first part, Moritz went through a selection of 5+1 works that have shaped and influenced his critical thinking, his practice in data viz, 5 works of others, 1 work of his own. We now switch over to Enrico Bertini, who will look at things from a more kind of academic research perspective, befitting one hat of his many hats in his career. Once again, Enrico, a little bit of an opener from yourself. When and how did you get into data viz as a thing, also then as a career?
My memory is not the best, but I think the way it happened is that I remember two key moments. One is, interestingly, I read a book many years ago about virtual reality. And I was really fascinated by this idea of, I think we're talking about the late 90s, something like that. So back in the day. And I was really fascinated by this idea that by creating graphical representations of something, you could explore information spaces, right? And right after, I don't remember how many years after, but it must have been not too many, I came across a book called Readings in Information Visualization. And that book was one of the very early books that started the whole field, right? And it was basically a collection of papers coming from a gathering that some researchers had. And I stumbled.
Bad print quality, black and white.
Very bad print quality.
Do you remember?
And yeah. And it was organized in 2 chapters. And every chapter had a little introduction and then a few papers that exemplified the ideas in the chapter, right? And I remember sifting through these books, and I was completely blown away. I think similar to what Moritz said was like, I don't know what this is about. I want to do this. You know, those moments where it's like, that's what I want to do.
Sounds amazing. What is it?
I don't know why, but that's exactly what I want to do, right? And I was also convinced that I wanted to pursue an academic career. My goal was to have a lab. I was really influenced by this book that I mentioned because a large section of the book was about describing researchers in academic labs doing pioneering research. So I connected these 2 things. And this is how I got started.
How fun. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting how, I suppose back then, and likewise for yourself, Moritz, you're looking there for a spark about a career that probably doesn't even exist necessarily in quite formal terms with a job title and a role. And it's almost this kind of leap of faith that this might become a thing that I can sort of find a place in. Which again makes you wonder now, the people leaving university or whatever age group they find themselves in looking for careers, maybe the things that they will work in doesn't yet even exist as a formal track. But before we get into your selections, Enrico, I'm mindful that across these shows, across these seasons, I've not really had many people who we've discussed kind of academic aspects of data, and I'm sometimes mindful that people don't always know what one knows about things like academic research. And I'm sometimes aware that people don't even really know what is research in an academic sense. What is a research project? Would you mind just sort of alluding to a kind of a high level, almost like a Gemini summary of what academic research looks like but in a data viz context?
We need another 10 episodes.
So throw Enrico in a big crisis already just by asking.
He's out.
So let's see how can we summarize that. It's so in researching visualization is really interesting because it's something that has been growing organically, and you have researchers that come from many different directions. So it's very hard to say what is this research because there are so many flavors, right? But if we want to draw a map, I would say there are a number of recurring ways of doing research in visualization. I would say there's some people who are focusing more on the technical side of things, so typically coming from computer science and engineering. So this is like, how do we develop new techniques and new software that helps people do data visualization, right? Infrastructure, programming languages, applications. Just to give you an example, Tableau is actually came from actually academic research, for instance, right? And many languages that have been developed.
It's like the tree map or edge bundling, or so that people would just pick up and then work with it and see
there's so many,
what can you do with it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But then there's another part that is more about traditional scientific research, where there are people who study more the cognitive and psychological aspects of data visualization. And this is typically, there are typically experiments, right? So lab experiments where researchers put people in front of different visualizations and measure as carefully as they can specific metrics, right? Assign tasks and compare different type of visualizations to then say this one works better than that one under certain conditions for certain tasks, right? And then I would say there are more social aspects of data visualization. So trying to understand the social aspects. And I would say these are three main branches of data visualization research.
And I think your selections that we're going to go through kind of cover that range of different perspectives quite perfectly. Yeah. And your selections are also all based on the kind of dissemination of these projects, which is typically a journal article or a paper. So and as you said about your entry into data, reading these things was the kind of the route that you got into. And I just wanted, before we get into your selections, just pick up on one point that we talked about in the last part, which was the kind of coexistence of the academic and research side with the practitioner side in database. I remember when we all got into this, there was a sense that these two lanes were quite separated. Now, you've also spoken, Enrico, that the best are when one will feed off another and one will kind of build on that and then kind of sort of almost balance between the two. As we're now in 2026, how kind of healthy is that relationship? Does it work quite sort of symbiotically, or has it changed? Has it improved?
It's amazing. I think it's way, way more integrated than it used to be. Sorry. I think the influence goes both ways, and it's been going both ways for many years now. So I think it's one of the most exciting, from my personal perspective, it's one of the most exciting things that happened over the years, also because I have personally been advocating and trying to do basically everything I've done other than academic work has been on trying to create these kind of bridges, right?
And translate things to the everyday.
Yeah, I always felt that it was really important for researchers to get a better understanding of what practitioners do, because they tend to be very isolated from what is the real world of data visualization. I think this is no longer true now, right? But back then, there were two completely different worlds, right? And at the same time, I thought that it was important for practitioners to know of the existence of researchers and what they were doing, because they could learn something out of it. But over the years, this has become like so much more integrated. I had examples of, again, data journalists mentioning papers that they read that inspired the work that they have done, and researchers starting their article by saying, oh, I saw this online and this is why we want to study it. And now it's common practice.
Yeah. No, that sounds kind of encouraging based on where it did come from, maybe 20 years ago, but certainly sounds a healthier sort of relationship. So we move on to the first of your selections, and I guess I'm pretty sure that, as Moritz found with his, you had to scour mentally through hundreds and thousands maybe of different things that had significance. But again, you've done this through the perspective of what mattered perhaps most to you in your journey. So the first one is titled Narrative Visualization, Telling Stories with Data, which is language that we are very much now familiar with. Edward Siegel and Jeffrey here, and Jeff here is a name that kind of recurs through a few of your selections. But sort of tell us about this and also why you felt it was worthy of selection.
So we start with the perfect example of what I was saying, right? So back then, so today narrative, if I tell you telling a story with data is what it's bread and butter for everyone, right? Back then in academic circles, telling stories with data was like, what?
Witchcraft.
Story?
Who would do
the
that?
word right? For many years, we had this debate about storytelling, right? So this paper is a great example of what I was saying, right? So all in a sudden, Jeff and Edward realized that there was this booming area of data visualization in journalism, right? And we had every week one new piece, right? From New York Times, from Bloomberg, from Washington Post, right? And I think they've been really, really smart because they came up with this idea of like, how do we characterize what is happening in this space? And basically what they did, they collected a very large set of examples from news and media. And then they figured out how can we organize these examples into prototypical patterns, right? And the paper is basically first an explanation of why this is important, then a description of the methodology that they followed, and then the description of these patterns that they tend to recur into these journalistic pieces, right? And then they have a section where they actually show these patterns in action with practical examples, right? And the patterns themselves have been influential, but even more influential, I think it was like breaking the glass and saying, look, this thing exists. And there are so that was a landmark paper, right? Because after this paper, so many other people started working in that space from the research standpoint. They realized that there was this thing as journalistic pieces, and what do we have to learn, and what kind of research do we have to do on top of it?
And it's that sense of it also sort of
and with these patterns, it was really
Go ahead, Mo.
It was really practically important, or it had practical relevance because we were like, oh yeah, interesting, Bertini glass structure. This is a way
I could do it this way or that way.
And sort of, exactly. And the other thought that I took from that paper is what this podcast series is based on, this idea that there's a spectrum between exploration and explanation. Explore, explain, it's not a binary. You know, there's a whole space in between. And I think they captured this really well as well.
Well, that's it. And I think what was nice about this from an accessibility point of view, or at least maybe a digestibility point of view, perhaps better. I first encountered this project through the website that was built with the 7 genres presented and the examples, and then I found the paper. But because they were so, as I said, accessible as little sort of motifs of the model or the idea, it became such I can see that, and I can see how it's been applied into the real world. And what I'm curious about now is perhaps how that shapes future practice. Do people then adopt only the 7 genres? They don't, of course. But how this sort of cycle then triggers. I'm thinking, Moritz, Napa cards. I'm thinking you created the Napa cards, or you collaborated on the Napa cards, but how much was that? Because that was a collection of different sort of. Did you budget a storytelling approaches? I can't remember the exact premise, but I'm just wondering how much that was driven by this, or kind of stood alone.
Yeah, so this came out of a Darkstuhl workshop the very theme of narrative, like data visualization, and. So the Hare paper identified genres of whole applications, like it's although they also had these individual parts, but it was mostly about how's the whole
comic
experience
strip of the thing,
and what's the genre of the whole thing, and we looked more at individual mechanisms that you can employ to make one step in the narrative, basically,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And how can you make an individual piece of information more interesting? But I think there's very similar motivation. And also this idea of, hey, maybe we find something that people can use in their daily work as like, oh, suddenly we have 12 options we can discuss with our client. So like this
Yeah.
option might work for our case, and that helps us work better, right?
That's right.
I think that's a really nice example of applicable research. Yeah.
And I think, again, if you think about the context of journalism, data journalism, visual journalism, efficiency is very important to them. So to have almost these, I wouldn't reduce it as templates, but to have these sort of mechanisms almost available on a shelf to pick from, to then spend more time focusing on what is the story, what's the best communication method, and not having to invent every time some kind of plot or structure to kind of show stuff is, again, how it kind of reveals how much this is now, just as Enrico introduced it, so much part of the fabric of what we now see as the data viz field. Nothing more part of the fabric than D3, which is the second selection. So D3, data-driven documents.
What's that? Never heard of it. What is it?
This is the paper. I mean, there's multiple authors, but I think Mike Bostock is perhaps the most kind of associated name with this, alongside Vadim Ogievetsky and Jeff here again. I mean, this to people watching, listening, you may be familiar with D3 JavaScript, the common library which has dominated the last 13 or so years with sort of interactive web-based viz. So its selection probably goes without any need for detailed justification, but nevertheless, give me your detailed justification, Enrico.
Okay, so I think the impact of D3 is very hard to overestimate. It's just like a bomb, right, in the data visualization world when it happened. The funny thing about D3, I don't know how many people know that, is that it started as a class project. So the stories that Mike was in Jeff's class, and typically in data visualization classes, you develop a project, and Mike came up with this idea of creating visualization declaratively with JavaScript. Right?
Although there was Protovis, which I think
exactly
had a lot of properties already,
yeah.
And that was one of Jeff Hare's earlier projects.
So Jeff's
he took
lab,
it to another level.
Yeah. So Jeff tried to create this language, several languages over time, right? So this thing existed already in a environment where Jeff has been trying to address this problem from so many different angles, right? I think one of the early languages that he developed was like, Moritz, do you remember it was something around Flash? I know that you liked Flash a lot back then. I don't remember. Flare, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. There was this.
So that was
this
very
language.
Java-driven.
Yeah.
Big architecture, like very enterprise architecture. Almost.
Exactly. Right. Again, so similar to what I was saying in the first part. Today, it seems like it's a given that you can create data visualizations on the web. But back then, it took us many, many years to figure out how to do data visualization on the web, right? And Jeff was one of the pioneers because he really tried creating different languages. And in this milieu, basically, Mike came up with this idea, right? And it's really interesting because when I saw D3 for the first time, I was like, what is this? It's really kind of quirky way of doing things, but because it's not
quite complicated.
It's quite honestly right. It's complicated.
In a way, it was this big, like, it opened it to so many people, but it's also gatekeeping in a way because it has this totally weird logic behind it. It's really hard to grasp.
Right.
But also, just from a timing point of view, though, I'm just trying to think of the time scale. Yeah. At what point around this would Flash have been essentially made obsolete? Because
I think by the time
Flash and processing had their great time before, let's say, 2008 or 9, and then Steve Jobs decided iPads won't run Flash or iOS, right? And Flash was dead within weeks. It was just a power move by Steve Jobs. so everybody had to think about, oh, how do we now do things with open standards? And there was a lot of like libraries to animate SVG graphics or HTML. And literally everything was thrown back 10 years. Everything was super slow. Everything was super hard to do. Everything was clumsy. And D3 was the first library that performed really well and had a halfway reasonable architecture. That's my theory of why it was successful. It was just fast and it was suddenly okay-ish. And there were lots of examples and lots of algorithms you could work with.
You could see it in
practice.
practice.
That's the other thing. Like Mike had this bost.ox.org site where there were just hundreds of scripts. And I think that was also a big part of the success.
And then you sort of take that forward a couple of years, I think. And Mike's now working at New York Times doing Viz on, center stage with D3 behind his work. So that's
true. He worked at the Times too. Just forgot about that.
Yeah.
Crazy. Insane.
So no, a completely justified inclusion there. Number 3 is what makes a visualization memorable.
Yes.
I remember this paper getting a lot of kind of coverage at the time. This is 2013, so it's amazing how long that ago is. There's multiple authors on this. I think Michelle Borkin is the name that I most remember against this project. But what's the sort of rationale for this inclusion?
Okay, I think once again, this is one of those papers that marked a change of perspective, right? So up to that point, visualization research was all about performance, right? So what researchers used to do was to create experiments to figure out whether you can do something faster, right?
Yeah.
Or with less errors,
or more accurately,
or more accurately, right? And how it is in science and research, people just try to build on top of each other. So it was a given that you would be studying visualization from that perspective, right? And I think this is one of the first papers where, and the reason why I think it's really important is because let's look at a different kind of, it's no longer about only performance, it's about something else, another cognitive construct, right? And it's memorability, right? It's like after we see a visualization, what are the features of a visualization that make it memorable? So that once I don't have it in front of me anymore, what is going to make it memorable, right? And I think, again, this is one of those papers that opened up a lot of additional research, further research later on, because it almost gave permission to researchers to investigate different constructs, right? And not necessarily only about memorability, about other things, but to me, this was a moment that basically communicated, hey, you can actually look at something else. It doesn't have to be only about accuracy.
Not just faster insights.
Right?
But before that were a few years where creative people working in communicating with data were consistently bashed by the online crowd of efficiency.
Well, I mean, if you look at a paper, the intro,
it could have been a bar chart.
But you look at the intro to the paper, and I missed this at the time, but it frames it around what was the zeitgeist, which was, and it's not to put names on, but let's put names on it. The sort of Stephen Few, Edward Tufte corner about precision, accuracy, fastest, versus not so much the new crowd, but even down to the sort of chart junk, as Tufte positioned Nigel Holmes, one of my heroes in the field. Exactly. But when I first encountered this research, I initially went into it with a misconception about memorability as a motive, thinking I don't need to remember visualizations because I can retrieve them. I can bring them back up when I need them. I can print them. But it didn't occur to me until I got into it that it was more about that sense of an imprint, a legacy of what you've encountered, rather than can you remember what the value was on that axis. So it's no wonder then it almost kind of opened the gates and gave permission to this. I want to use a better term on this, but the sort of softer side of data viz, which is this perhaps more human perspective that maybe up until then hadn't been, or perhaps even mechanically couldn't have been easy to have explored.
Yeah, and it also represents a bold move, right? I really like when researchers try to do something out of the box. And as a side note, it's really hard to do that in research because research tends to be very conservative, right? So there's always this tension, right, between you want to do something exceptional, right? But if you are too far, right, people are going to have a hard time accepting your work. So I think that was a really clever move from them. It was like far enough but not too far, right?
Yeah.
And also methodologically.
And it was criticized at the time. Like a lot of people
yes,
criticized the
exactly.
study
Yeah.
very vocally online, like big
Exactly.
people. And
yes,
yeah, I think they had to defend it really. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So,
And the thing was
gives
that
you a
they were
sense of
able
the
to do
time.
that, which gave it that sense of, this is a substantial piece of work. This is a robust piece of work. And again, as you said, Enrico, it's within the realm of sort of pushing the boundaries, but still in a space that is robust, is repeatable, is defendable as a method. So it's no wonder it's sort of stands the test of time. And I think moving on from that notion of memorability as a judgment of effectiveness, the next paper from Tamara Munzner, a nested model for visualization design and validation from 2009. So it predates that, but it's not about the sort of lineage here. But this was I thought this was such an interesting piece about trying to distill the different ways that a visualization might succeed, or perhaps in this case might fall down, might sort of break down. So I'll let you kind of build on that, Enrico.
Okay, so this is a theoretical piece of work written by Tamara Munzner. And it's one of those pieces of research where once you read this thing and you look at it, there are two interesting effects. One is like, of course, it's so simple.
It's obvious.
It's obvious, right? But it's also like now everything I see from this point on goes under this lens.
Yeah.
You can't unseen it, right? So, and I like to explain for a moment what she did. What Tamara did was not only to break down. So I think what she tried to do was to break down what it is that we do as visualization designers and also researchers when we design a data visualization project, right? In a way, it's also similar or related to software engineering models that they have been developing over the years. And what she did was like, I think the brilliant move is not only that she tried to come up with the steps and say, okay, it's first this, then that, right? Like those steps. But also the idea that these steps are nested.
Yeah.
And why is it important that they're nested? It's important because if you fail at the early stage, all the problems are cascading into the other stages. So you have to be really careful because there's no way you can recover if you made a mistake early on, right? So maybe to make it more practical for your listeners to understand, I'll try to mention what the steps in the paper were. So she had domain problem characterization at the top level, which is basically like defining what is the problem. Then data operation and abstraction design, right? What are the data abstraction that you create in order to then build a visualization on top of it? Then the encoding and interaction technique, which is basically how do you actually visualize it and how do you interact with this thing? And then she had a final stage, which is algorithm design, which is not always present there, but in some cases it is present. You can imagine this more like implementation.
Yeah, the
right?
functional performance.
The functional part.
Yeah.
How do you actually implement
Also,
it?
the data
right?
aggregation, data transformation.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
All
Would
of these
come there.
things, right? But if you make a mistake early on and say, for instance, you are not solving the right problem, right? It doesn't matter, what, right? All
It's
the
so
rest.
funny because I just realized I use this model, but under different terms. So whenever I talk to clients about what we do in a project or what a good approach is, I always talk about why, what, and how, right? So What's our motivation? What are our goals? What is the format of saying, what do we offer? What's the product? And then how do we do it? Like, is it blue? Is it red? Is it green? It's exactly the same story. So it really,
But also,
it seems very
it's the
applicable
reverse
universally. Yeah.
that people experience it with. Your first encounter is, how does it work? And then you see what's
The
there,
actual how.
and you don't even get to the kind of outer layer of, is it the right thing that I need to understand as a piece of information communication? So that tension's interesting. But you're right, Enrico. This was when I first saw this, it was like this is so obvious. So obvious that no one's ever written it down before. So, it was and very
not
helpful.
Not so clearly. That's the thing.
That's the
this
thing.
clarity.
Yeah. And I also want to mention that this is what informed or inspired her book, which I think also had a big impact in the data visualization world. Her book is called Visualization Analysis and Design. And this is where another one of those examples where I think the connection between practitioners and researchers has been really, really strong, right? This is a book that has a very strong academic flavor, but somehow I've seen so many practitioners mentioning it as their main source of inspiration. And a whole generation of data visualization practitioners have learned data visualization from this book, which is really amazing. If you read the book has a pretty strong academic flavor, but still speaks to everybody.
Yeah.
And the whole book is based exactly on that model, right? So I think Tamara did an amazing job there.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a super, and you're right. We'll add a link to Tamara's book in the show notes because it's such a brilliant piece of text, really. That's, as you say, it's cut through the academic world. It's into the ether of practitioners as well.
Yeah.
Moving forward to the fifth selection, and I think it's something that, although it's 2018 as a piece, it feels very of the moment as well. Frames and slants in titles of visualizations on controversial topics. So when we think about academic research in data viz, it is at times about these little minutiae components and what's the best way to do that thing, or what's the way to not do that thing, or what happens if you do it in different ways, what's the kind of consequence. So what made you pick this one out of interest?
So many things to say about this one. The first thing is this is a paper that made me realize, among other things, that visualization is not only about visual encoding, right?
Sure,
it's another one of those situations where after once you see it, it's like, of course, it's obvious, right? But nobody talks about it. And what this paper did was not only to basically explain that titles are important, but also to show scientifically that titles may be even more important than the graphics, which is like, what are we doing here? Right?
Yeah.
So they did
pre-2015, I think a lot of us thought good data representation speaks for itself, right? Post-2015, we're like,
We might need to help these people.
Yes. So in a few words, what they did was a really clever experiment, right? Where they presented the same data and the same charts with different titles to people and see what happens. Right?
Smart, yeah.
And it turns out titles have a huge influence on what people retain and how they process the visualization. Just changing like a little sentence that is on top, right? So, of course, again, this opened up a lot of additional follow-up research, and I've been highly, highly influenced by this paper, really, because it really helped me think about the fact that when we talk about data visualization, it's much, much larger, much more complicated than we think. We've been for many, many years fixated with this model where what is the right channel to represent that piece of information, right? The old Bertin model, which is great. I mean, it really like foundational for us and for our field. But there's more. There's clearly way more than that, right?
Yeah.
And I think, again, this paper was really clever in presenting this idea with scientific backing, right? It's not just an idea. It's also like scientifically, I'm telling you that this is what is happening here, right? So I think it's a
But I think
brilliant.
what it also does is it, going back to your point about it's not just visualization is not just about the chart. It also exposes the things that are inevitably and can only ever be subjective choices. And it's saying, we can't tell you what the right title is, but just know the effect of different titling approaches. Now, in some ways, it gives people, approaches to distort the truth, to kind of lie, but it's not, that's not the point of this. It's about saying that there are so many different aspects where we are the editors and we have to just embrace that role. I mean, Mo, I'm sure you've also been influenced by this idea of the titles and the explanations and the written annotations that we have to bring into our thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also this idea of authorship, as you say, that we cannot hide behind the data or the best practice chart, and then we're out of the game as authors, but we always have an active role in how information is perceived.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you cannot not communicate in that context. Everything has to fit. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think that 5 terrific selections, actually, Enrico. I think you've done a really good job there, characterizing not just what's been important in the field, but also the breadth and the diversity of the academic world. So your +1 is a piece that you were authored, listed as an author. I think there's 6 authors for this, so I won't read everyone's names out, but we'll include, of course, in the show notes. This is showing people behind data, something we've kind of touched on already in the first part with Mo, but I'll let you expand on this. I'll let you expand, especially on the sort of the subtitle or the further title.
Okay. Yes. So this is a project that took place in my lab. And I want to start by mentioning the fact that the whole idea is the brainchild of Jeremy Boy, who is a designer and researcher. And back then he was working in my lab, and just one day came. So we were working with group of collaborators working in human rights. And we had this fantastic project on visualization for human rights. And we were working, my main colleague is a lawyer, right? And we were like so interesting to talk to, like, I was in engineering, working with people in human rights that are trained as lawyers has been one of the most enriching projects of my career, right? And Jeremy was there working with us as a postdoc, and we had many meetings. And one day he comes to the lab and says, I had an idea. I want to study this idea of what happens when we visualize data about people. What happens if we try to use icons that represent people in a more realistic way, right? And he really wanted to create the design space of what is possible and levels of reality, right? And then again, study scientifically what is the effect of doing that, right? So there were 2 parts that were really interesting there. One was, what is the design space of realism, right? And the second part was, what happens when you actually try to move across the spectrum of realism, and how can we study it scientifically, which is a whole can of worms we went through, right? And we zeroed in on the idea of measuring empathy. And I think it's worth remembering that back then there was a whole discussion about whether visualization is capable of communicating empathy. There was a whole idea about the empathic art. I think it was Alberto Cairo talking about the empathic art. And there was a whole discussion online about whether it's possible or it's even desirable for visualization to communicate things with empathy. Great. And of course, it crossed really well with this idea. If we want to communicate data with empathy, maybe we have to use more realistic objects rather than dots and squares, right?
Yeah.
And
but it's the idea of almost embracing the need sometimes to use perhaps positive manipulations, communication devices, not just things that are purely sort of neutral, but sometimes we have to use these to create persuasion and engagement.
Yeah. And I think I think two main reasons why I wanted to mention this project is one is because it's once again one of those examples where practitioners and academia really influenced each other a lot. I believe that the idea that Jeremy had was inspired by something that he saw online, right? But what really surprised me is that over the years after that paper was published, many people started using the word anthropographics, which he invented. He came up with this idea of anthropographics, and somehow it became part of the lingo, right? And so what it's been really surprising for me after many years is that sometimes online I come across anthropographics and I'm like, wow, this is actually used. Right? This term is used, right? Which is connected to something that I wanted to say at the beginning, also in relation to the narrative viz paper, of the value of just introducing a language to define certain concepts. Once you have the language, people can use those words, and now we can talk about those concepts, which is something that is really, really, really valuable.
I think it is also, as we sort of leave, and that's a brilliant selection, Enrico. But I also think, as we are where we are now in 2026, and the AI thing that's now, unavoidable, and you, amongst many other people, Enrico, have really you've really embraced this, and you're looking at it, and you're finding quite positive, hopeful ways of embracing it, not just in academic research, but also in practice. But it makes you realize that although parts of our, and I say our as freelance professionals in this space, part of our duties may evolve because there are new methods to remove the need for us. But when you boil it down to an engagement of prompts and language, we still need to have this glossary and this vocabulary to know what even to ask for. So
Absolutely.
we're not redundant. It just might evolve the art and the practice.
Oh, yeah. We could talk for hours about that. My personal, this is such a complex space, but I would say my personal experience working with AI tools is really like, when I reflect on the way I use these tools, and I go back to the ongoing debate on whether these machines are going to replace us and all the rest, right? And also the ethics of using these AI tools, which is a whole really complicated story. We could go on for hours. My personal experience with it is that when I ask an AI tool to do something in a domain that I know well, like data visualization, I am able to ask things that I believe other people wouldn't be able to ask without, and wouldn't be able to use the right terminology, and most probably wouldn't be able to get the same kind of results because they are not able to express these things in a prompt, right? At least that's my personal experience. I might be wrong. It would be nice to really understand to what extent this is true. Maybe it's just wishful thinking. I can't tell. But my personal experience, like when I do something professionally with these tools, I see that I use words and concepts and I ask follow-up questions that it seems really hard that a person who is not as knowledgeable as you in that space would be able to get to the same results, right?
Yeah.
But again, I'm also open to being demonstrated that this is just wishful thinking. I think things are changing so fast that it's really hard in this space to have a final word on anything.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, I'll let you more have a final word on that kind of point. What's your kind of thoughts on that topic in a nutshell?
Oh, absolutely agree. I think that's also a great contribution research can make, is like to shape that vocabulary and show all the richness of what's out there, but also how you can structure it and how you can describe it. And I totally think language is so key. And if you just prompt by saying, give me an awesome visual, you're gonna get something fairly boring. But if you have a more nuanced way of describing what you're actually after, right?
Yeah.
Suddenly things get more interesting. So I think there's absolutely something to it. And this will be a key skill and not something that goes away. And that's also my feeling with AI in general, is that it takes down a lot of the the obstacles that are like just technical and just getting it done. But what the right it is that you want to get done, and what your attitude towards it is, and what you want to achieve with it, and if it's the right thing for the people you work with or yourself, or if it does the right thing in the world, that's something no LLM will be able to tell us. And so
I think we can
having
almost
like a position, a clear like attitude towards data, that's still super valuable. It's gonna get more important even.
Well, it is, and I think we can almost sort of loop this back to Tamara's model, where the outer model, the first thing we have to get
becomes
right,
more important.
ever so. Whereas the
Absolutely.
inner bits are the things that can be assisted by this stuff. So let's close things there. So thank you guys ever so much. Been wonderful to spend an hour and 50 in your company, although for the audience, 2 parts. But some wonderful selections there. Thank you ever so much for those insights. And to the viewers and listeners, thank you for watching or listening. See you again soon on Explore Explain. Bye for now.
To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing and spreading the word. See you next time.